Time to play the game. Time to play the game!
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a special live stream. We have a debate that I'm hosting. I'm the moderator, fellow traveler. On the left, we have Jason Unruhe, and on the right, we have Man in the Wall. And they're going to just have a talk. We're going to have a friendly conversation, and I want this to be a nice, clean discussion. I am going to be moderating, like I said, and so a couple ground rules. If I notice one of you guys are just being dicks to one another, or the discussion's not going anywhere, or I already talked to both of you beforehand. No drama.
Anybody goes full serve.
Yeah, no prior drama is going to be brought up from Jason's past. And Jason, don't, just no shit flinging. Just be cool to one another. Otherwise, from this point on, I am but a ghost, and I will only interject when you guys need me to do a fact check or when you have a question for me. So with that being said, I will now shut up.
Okay. I think probably most of the people in the audience know who we are, but I figured that just in case that we're seeing anyone who is not, we should probably both introduce ourselves and explain like who we are and what we do. How about you go first, Jason?
I am Jason Unruhe. Last 12 years, journalist, Press TV contributor, surf hater.
Let's hope that this discussion goes better than your one with the serfs. How about that?
I guarantee it will.
Well, I hope it does. I genuinely do. So hi, my name is Man in the Wall. I started doing content pretty recently. My first video was in July. I talk a lot about historical revisionism, from what I consider to be historical revisionism from tankies. So I've done videos on Caleb Motben. I've done videos on Hakeem. I've done videos on Bay Area 451 or 15. I think it's 15. And I've also done it from reactionaries. I did a video responding to PragerU's video on the Vietnam War. I did one about Augusto Pinochet and how Tom Woods and Axel Kaiser on their show were basically defending him. I'm going to be making a video about the many crimes of former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Generally, I consider myself to be a left-leaning social democrat. I have a lot of criticisms of tankies, but I've also had some relatively pleasant conversations with them. I've had some nice conversations with Danky Kang, and I've had some good conversations in private with fellow traveler. And I hope to have a good conversation with you too, Jason.
Yeah, same here. Totally. Yeah, I mean, we can pretty much be united in the fact that PragerU is a pile of garbage.
Did you see that they basically made like a video that was almost like kind of defending slavery, like a little bit or whatever? Or did you see that at all?
Yes, and I did see their one on the Vietnam War.
Oh, it's garbage. Oh, it's so bad. That response video is one of my personal favorites. It's is it the one with Victor David Hansen, or is it the other one?
Yeah, I think it was Victor David Hansen.
Oh yeah, like where they were saying that like South Vietnam was a democracy or some ridiculous crap like that.
Yeah.
America fought the Vietnam War for the defense of freedom in Asia. Yeah, sure.
Come on, let's be honest. That was a war between the United States and the Soviet Union for influence. Come on.
I mean, it was a war between the Soviet Union and also People's Republic of China to like a lesser extent.
At that time, I'm really sketchy about whether or not China really gave a shit. But
I mean, obviously, there's like a long history of like hostility between China and Vietnam. So I mean, I can understand
Vietnam and everybody else.
That is true. I mean, they kicked out the Chinese, then they kicked out the French, then they kicked out the Japanese, and they kicked out the Americans, and then the Cambodians tried to invade them and failed miserably. So
they're literally that groundskeeper Willie meme, like Vietnamese and Chinese, like Japanese and Vietnamese, like Vietnamese and other Vietnamese.
Yeah. So anyway, one thing that I have to say is that I really I never would have in my wildest dreams ever thought I would have a conversation with you. Because I mean, you seemed like, I mean, I only have like 300 subscribers and you have like 40K. So I'm just frankly, I mean, obviously we have a lot of disagreements, but I'm just frankly really honored that I have the chance to be here. You know, I mean, I would have never expected this.
I mean, I wouldn't have expected it either, except that I lost my temper. So
It's okay. I mean, I mean, I know you said that like you were going to rip my head off and drink my fucking blood, but
I've said a lot worse about other people.
it's cool. It's cool, man. I appreciate that like we're here, we're talking, and like and I mean like I just hope that like we can maybe like clear up some misconceptions and like kind of like with the Yankee Kang debate, like maybe show that to some people who might not have otherwise considered my positions that you know, that I'm not just like a Freikorp or just like someone who just like is just this virulent anti-communist who hates anything left of Bernie Sanders. I want to make it clear to these people. So obviously the discussion was going to be about some of the stuff that I said in my discussion with Yankee Kang that I know you had some major disagreements with. So would you like to get on with that?
Yeah, sure. You were saying how Social Democrats won certain concessions, like you know, or the prototype to universal healthcare from Otto von Bismarck.
Yeah, actually, I have some notes about that.
Yeah,
would you like?
I would like to respond to say that I am not totally familiar with that particular situation. But I would argue that it really wasn't so much a victory of people arguing against, I mean, part of like a demand that they gave into. I would say that it's something that while they were pressured into it, it was something that the bourgeoisie realized that they needed. For example, the reason National Health Service really started in the UK was essentially around the time of the Boer War, when it came time to draft people or to get people to fight in the UK to fight the war. They looked around and they realized, oh my God, everybody is sick and weak. These aren't going to be very good soldiers.
Like, right? Oh, sorry, I don't want to interrupt. But wasn't the NHS formed right after the Second World War?
Yeah, but I'm saying like that kind of thinking, like this, not specifically the NHS, but public health programs in general.
Okay. Do you mind if I like kind of respond to that?
Let me finish. I got more to say.
Okay,
so
cool.
In terms of the situation of the UK, they realized everybody here is so sick and weak because their health is bad. And if you've got that, then your conscripts are going to suck. So they realized they needed something to take over to try to combat that. And then later on, I would actually argue that the creation of the NHS was a deliberate tactic to avoid possible revolutionary potential from what many would describe as the far left, which was much more powerful in Europe than it was in North America. But at the same time, universal healthcare came into Canada literally from social democrat struggles and really one hell of a one. I don't know if you know the story of how it came into Canada.
I know like a little bit about it. I know it was like a really long, hard fought battle with the obviously the Social Democrats push for it, and it's something that Canadians today are really proud of, as they should be, I think.
Yeah, it started in the province of Saskatchewan, which is really strange because now it's like a pit of reaction. Basically, what it was that farmers kept going bankrupt because they couldn't pay medical bills. So the NDP, or the New Democrat Party, which was made up of people from the Communist Party after it was outlawed, who, for all intents and purposes, were social democrats, because that's exactly what they were doing. They were doing social democracy. They got together and they ran on a platform of that for the premiership of the province. And the federal government did everything they could to sabotage it. And eventually they won. And was the premiership of the province. And then the federal government tried to bankrupt the entire province for trying to create a universal healthcare system. So in one end, it depends on the individual situation. It's not simply SOCDEMs forced it, because there were a lot of radical left who were pushing for a universal healthcare system too. I would actually argue that the system itself created it as a concession to avoid any more particularly radical struggles. But I would also argue at the same time, from a purely bourgeois economic standpoint, a universal healthcare system just literally is better. It provides better services, it provides better health, and it's done more cheaply and more efficiently. And there is nothing but a gigantic mountain of data to prove that.
Okay, can I respond to those points?
Yeah.
Okay, so as far as the whole social democrats pushing, I never denied that obviously it wasn't just the social democrats who pushed for universal healthcare in developed countries, also democratic socialists and anarchists and communists. So I never denied that. Obviously, that was a struggle that took up the entire left. But specifically in the case of Otto von Bismarck, you're right that it was a concession to prevent more radical change from taking place. But for one, that's still better than the alternative. I mean, a concession is still, at least to some extent, a victory. It might not be a full victory, but especially when it comes to universal healthcare, I mean, the idea, particularly, I think, me and fellow traveler are both from America. We can concede to how fucked up our system of private healthcare is. And whatever problems Canada might have with its healthcare system, it's still a vast improvement.
I just want to add, the main problem that we have in Canada, the healthcare system, is the dickheads in Ottawa defunding it.
I mean, that can be a big problem. I mean, the same thing happened in the UK, as far as I know, with the NHS. Yeah. But I mean, universal healthcare is still a major concession. It's not a small thing. And the second thing is that in the case of Germany under Otto von Bismarck, they did that as an attempt because they thought what it was going to do was it was going to quell the socialists and make it so they couldn't rise up. But it didn't work. The SDP became a more and more influential body in the Reichstag until eventually in 1912, I believe it held a majority. So that was a case where they tried to make a concession to appease people, and it didn't work. It made people want more. So I think sometimes people say oh, these concessions will just make it so that people will just be satisfied and go on with their lives. But that's not always how it works. I mean, we can see I think plenty of times through history how just moderate reforms have ultimately led to more serious revolutionary change, and those moderate reforms were just the backbone of it.
Hey, just a real quick interjection, Man of the Wall. I disconnected you from the Discord.
It's cool. No problem. I wasn't really using the Discord anyway. That was. Anyways, that was pretty much all I really wanted to say. I was just going to let Jason respond now.
Yeah, I would say that it is a double-edged sword. You could pressure them into it, and they could end up either the forces pushing for it could capitulate after they get it, or it could embolden them. So it really is a double-edged sword. It could go either way.
I don't necessarily disagree with that. I think that I
think we have seen it go both ways.
I mean, there are times when it obviously went the other direction. I think the New Deal in the United States is probably a good example of that. But there are times I would say universal healthcare in Germany is one example where it does the opposite. And also this is just going to be a fundamental disagreement with us. But I think that as a social democrat, I'm not someone who has a particular interest in seeing the entire system be overthrown. More that I'm interested in just radically changing the framework of what we have currently, rather than just start from scratch and create a completely different system. That just might be an area where we disagree.
Yeah, I guess we could push that, but I would also argue that it's not really tremendously a different system. I would say that the main thing would be that even in a social democracy, the inherent contradictions of capitalism remain. They don't get solved. They get delegated to some extent, but the antagonism between capital and labor still remains. And I would say that social democracy is really only possible in a first world country, because only a first world country would really have enough, for the lack of a better word, wealth in order to be able to do it.
Okay. So as far as that goes, there were 2 points there. As far as the social democracy doesn't fundamentally change things, I mean, it doesn't fundamentally alter the capitalist structure. And like I said in the Danke King debate, I don't necessarily think that capitalism is a system that will last forever. I think that mostly because I just don't think any economic system lasts forever. Eventually, there'll be a turning point and we'll move towards something else. My main argument was mostly that I think social democracy for right now is the best system that we have. And I disagree with the idea that it doesn't fundamentally change things. I mean, you take the Scandinavian countries like Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Finland, Sweden. And these countries have plenty of problems. I mean, obviously Sweden bungled the coronavirus, but I would say that living in those countries is preferable to living in the United States, for example, or some other super corrupt capitalist countries that are not coming to my head. But you kind of get what I'm going at. As far as the idea that a social democracy can only exist in the first world, I mean, we've had leaders that essentially governed as social democrats. This is something that people kind of misconstrued me for when I mentioned Salvador Allende, and I was saying that he was a social democrat when he wasn't. I wasn't saying that he was a social democrat. I know that in reality he was a Dem Soc and a Marxist, but I think in practice a lot of his reforms were essentially social democratic, and they did a lot of really good things for Chile for the brief time in which he ruled before he was overthrown. And we've seen other examples of that, I'd say probably some of the Indian leadership in the 1970s would be an example. The Jamaican prime minister, who again I don't remember the name of, he was the mixed race one, and as well as probably some others who have, I guess maybe even Nelson Mandela, maybe to a certain extent in South Africa, who essentially governed as social democrats. Now you can argue that because these countries are less wealthy, they can't have social democracies that are as wealthy as they are. But I think that the basic idea of having social democratic programs can exist in the third world. I mean, most third world countries have universal health care. That's not to say they're necessarily great or amazing, but they do have these systems.
I don't think most third world countries have a universal healthcare system.
I think that I've seen this on. Do you mind if I just Google this and send it to fellow traveler?
Yeah.
Because I'm pretty sure that that's true. They have at least some kind of at least free healthcare. I'm not sure if it's entirely universal. Here, universal healthcare by country.
I mean, by virtue of being more efficient, most countries have some kind of national healthcare plan. It's just in a lot of those poorer countries, their healthcare systems just aren't as good, just because they're not as wealthy. But
I don't necessarily disagree with that. I mean, I wouldn't. That'd be silly.
Yeah.
But I do think that I guess for me, it's just Unruhe. I mean, you can clarify your position, but it seemed like you were kind of insinuating on the idea that you could only really have social democratic programs in a first world country, and I don't entirely agree with that or necessarily think that's true. Here, I found the map that I was looking for. Let me send it to fellow travelers so we can show it on the screen.
Well, I mean, I was particularly referring to the social democracy that we know, the Norway, the Sweden, the Finland. That's the one people want.
I mean, I'm not saying that most third world countries could oh, here, it's the first one. The red ones in red are the ones that don't have universal health care. So as you can see, that's
America and Africa.
I mean, Algeria has it, Namibia, Botswana, Zambia, and the ones in blue have.
But how effective is it?
The ones in blue have free healthcare.
But I mean,
And
is it really on par with a universal healthcare system? Like, could you really compare it to Cuba?
I mean, I don't know. I'll grant you that Cuba does have very good health systems. I won't dispute that. And I'm not necessarily saying that like these systems are like good per se or as good as social democracy. That would be not as good as social democracy, as good as like social democracies in Scandinavia. That'd be ridiculous. But
Yeah.
I think like you were kind of insinuating like they wouldn't be as good as they would be in like first world countries, and I don't disagree with that. But I think and I mean I think we've seen like a lot of the countries that have adopted like these more like social democratic reforms have been better off for it. I mean, even like, you know, like with Cuba's universal healthcare. I mean, I have many issues with Cuba and the way that it's led, but its healthcare system, you know, it's universalized, it's public, and it's very good and very efficient. I can't deny that.
Yeah, I mean, you have to be pretty dishonest to say that providing public health is a bad idea. I mean, you really would have to be insane. I mean, there's no rational person, even the most bourgeois economists will say, yes, it is more efficient and it's better for society in general. A workforce that isn't sick is more productive. I mean, that's just a basic economic principle.
I mean, I would not entirely disagree with that. Maybe there are some loony Austrian economics.
Yeah, but I mean, those guys aren't even like really bourgeois. They're just insane. In fairness, they are.
It depends on like what your definition of bourgeois is, but whatever. I think
I would say someone that the ruling elite the capitalist class would take, like Paul Krugman, for example.
Hey, so what exactly is the point of contention here? You both agree that single payer good, private healthcare bad. But what was your original point again, Jason? That basic.
Okay. Yeah. I just wanted to answer two other things. The reforms by Allende, they were social democratic reforms, but I would say they were part of a path towards socialism. They were part of a process that was going to continue had he not been couped. That's all. And you're right. No system can last forever. I mean, literally, we live on a planet with finite resources. No system could ever last forever. And in fact, even Marx says there will be another phase after communism. He says he doesn't know what it is, but he said it will reveal itself to us when the time comes, meaning we're eventually going to see something better, or something that is the next stage in the evolution of the productive and social relations. But I would say that largely because of the advancements of social democracy, I mean, the good ones, the ones that we see in Western Europe are bought with imperialism, the exploitation of the third world. One of the arguments that we make against capitalism is because of its need to constantly do that. I mean, we have a world where literally it's competition. It's based on competition, you know, rather than, you know, portioning out according to each individual as they have need. And because of that, you're always going to have these major, you know, imperialist conflicts because of this. And that means that a certain section of the population, which is no longer simply something that was largely domestic during Marx's time, but something that's more international now that capital has a far greater ability to move than it did during Marx's time, and that social democracy is something that can only exist when there is a measure of inequality. And that if you had social democracy without inequality, you'd basically have socialism anyway.
Okay, can I respond to this?
Yeah.
Okay, so as far as the second point, like the whole Allende was moving towards democratic socialism, that may be true. I think it probably is true, but I think that doesn't necessarily take away from the fact that the social democratic reforms that he did implement were both extremely popular and extremely effective.
Yes.
And then the third thing, this is like a big one that I get a lot, and I talked about this a little bit in the Danke King debate, as far as like the social democracy can only exist with imperialism. I don't know if I entirely agree with that. For one, I think we'd have to consider like the idea of like is all the wealth in the West based on like exploitation of the third world. Now, if we're talking about countries like, say, the UK or France or Germany, which have long histories of colonial empires and colonial exploitation, then I think you could make an argument. But like the Scandinavian countries have not historically really been empires. I mean, they had usually most of their empires were pretty short-lived, and took place in like the 1500s. I just don't necessarily agree with the idea that it's inherently based on colonialism. I can agree that there are like Scandinavian nations that like do have companies which abuse third world workers, and that's bad. And we should take like regulatory steps to make sure that like if you're like exporting out to these countries, you pay your workers like a decent wage and decent whatever. But also, and this is kind of my main point, is that I don't necessarily agree with the idea that social democracy can only exist on the basis of imperialism. Like you could have like social democratic reforms, universal healthcare, like universal college tuition, all that stuff. And you could then still also like crack down on like corporations who like exploit like third world labor in like Bangladesh or whatever. And you could still probably make that balance work, at least in my opinion. I don't necessarily agree with the idea that at least in these countries, all that wealth is based on third world exploitation, or that a welfare state, even if we were to argue that the welfare state is paid for by imperialism, that it couldn't hypothetically be paid for like not through imperialism, through just like by just lessening exploitation of the third world through like regulation and stuff.
Okay, to that I would respond that the global the economy of the world is integrated. I mean, except for a few sections of Africa, etc., and give it time, they'll be there too. You don't have to have a past of colonialism in order to be a part of that structure. All you have to do is essentially get things cheaper from the third world in order to do that. If there wasn't a situation where the first world was exploiting the third world, then the only way that could happen is if there was an equal exchange of value. And capitalism ain't going to let that happen. Because if you have an equal exchange of value, then you don't have any profit. And that's one of my problems with mutualists, because they say, okay, yeah, we'll exchange equal values. Also, value is subjective. Well, then how is it equal? And even if it was equal, then profit couldn't exist.
Okay. I mean, as far as that goes, I mean, I guess like that's possible that you couldn't necessarily have completely equal exchange. But I mean, that doesn't, I mean, that hasn't like, I mean, just look at, I know obviously you're not necessarily defending this, but like look at China with like a lot of its projects with the Belt and Road. Like a lot of that is based on like very clear, like unequal exchange related stuff. Or even the Soviet Union during its like some of its Comic-Con stuff, it would extract like huge percentages of like raw materials from like the Warsaw Pact satellites. Like it took between like the 1950s and the 1970s, took like 90% of Czechoslovakia's uranium, which it was obviously using to build like nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants and stuff, or huge amounts of like Poland's zinc and Bulgaria's bauxite. So I mean, I agree that like unequal exchange under capitalism is a problem, but it's also something that I think can exist under socialist, or at least so-called socialist states. I think we'd both like call China like to some degree state capitalist, and I would call the USSR state capitalist, but you might disagree with me on that.
Yeah. I mean, literally without inequality, you don't have capitalism. It literally cannot function without it. I mean, that's the whole basis of profit, is bringing in more than you put out, because then you wouldn't have anything. But I would argue, but I would
agree with that, to be fair.
I mean, well, then how does profit exist?
Well, no, wait, I said I don't necessarily disagree with that. I said I don't necessarily.
Sorry. Okay, sorry, I misheard you. In terms of the Soviet Union, and particularly with the uranium, I don't see how that's necessarily an unfair exchange.
Well, I mean,
because I don't see how that defines the relationship between the two.
Well, I think that, like, for one, I don't know how you would feel about this, but I would absolutely say that like the Warsaw, like all of the Warsaw Pact countries were. Zizek. It's funny because he's Zizek and he's kind of weird. I mean, I would say like the Warsaw Pact countries were undeniably just like client states of the USSR, who essentially did whatever the USSR told them to, with the exception of like Yugoslavia and like Hoxha later in like the 60s and 70s. So I mean, I would call that like inherently a sort of exploitative relationship. And also like I mean, I just think like extracting like that large a percentage from of raw materials, especially considering Czechoslovakia sits on the second largest uranium fields in all of Europe, like sending that much for like very clear reasons. I mean, uranium is what you use to build like nuclear weapons and nuclear power plants. I mean, that almost kind of strikes me as almost inherently exploitative. And actually, the source that I got that from was from a Maoist news site. It was decrying the like Soviet Union under the Brezhnev years. So I mean, I would call that kind of relationship, at least to some degree, exploitative. Sorry if I've been going on too long.
I would say, but what is the nature of it that would make it exploitative? Because I'm certain the Soviet Union gave back as well. I would also say be very careful of sources that are Maoist, because during the Sino-Soviet split, Mao did say some pretty dishonest things about the Soviet Union, and some Maoists will take anything Mao said as completely uncritically. They'll just believe anything he said. Like I can't remember what's his name after Mao died. Said whatever Mao.
You got to take a lot of what Mao said in the later years of his life with a grain of salt.
This wasn't something that Mao said. It was like a Maoist news site.
Yeah. Well, there was just a point where he called the USSR a fascist dictatorship, and that's
I wouldn't call them fascist,
especially when
obviously.
I mean, as far as like whether or not they like paid it back. I would have to read that article again. It seemed that they were implying that the Soviet Union was engaging like unequal exchange with a lot of its like satellites and stuff. But I'll admit I don't have like hard evidence to necessarily suggest that like that was 100% what they were doing. But I would say they undeniably like pursued certain conflicts for like the interest of acquiring certain raw materials. Like, for example, I don't think it's a coincidence that like one of the conflicts they most heavily involved themselves in Africa was the Angolan Civil War, given that Angola is rich in both valuable metals, oil, and natural gas. And also that they like when Dubček started to get out of line, they invaded Czechoslovakia because I mean that's a huge uranium stockpile that like they need for nukes and nuclear power plants, and like the vast majority of that was going to them. So I don't think it's like necessarily unfair to say that like a lot of their political decisions like in economic decisions were based on a desire to like extract certain valuable resources from countries that were like essentially subservient to it. Same with like the United States and their sort of imperialism, like particularly in places like the Middle East.
I would say that the difference would be the class aspect of it. The Soviet Union was trying to push, even in the let's call it the less than ideal period, they were still trying to push the world towards a more socialist system, whereas the United States was running that basically off of profits. The Soviet Union was actually pushing for more of a national, self-determination, as opposed to the United States that wanted direct colonies. That is not to say that the Soviet Union was without criticism. I would agree with some people, and a lot of people say that Che Guevara would agree with me, because this is where there was allegedly a big blow up between Che Guevara and Fidel Castro over the relationship between the Soviet Union and Cuba. Che argued that the Soviet Union said to Castro, okay, Cuba is going to be a sugar producer. That's it. And then you'll send us 100 tons of sugar every year That was the number that Castro gave out publicly. There's no proof that came from the Soviet Union, but I suspect that it could be true. Kind of like a one-crop economy kind of thing, and in exchange it would receive all the material support necessary from the Soviet Union, including putting nuclear weapons into the country as a deterrent, and then being a son of a bitch and pulling them all out, which was completely a reactionary thing to do, in my opinion. But I think that the main point when it comes to the first and the third world is the unequal exchange that occurs between them, and I think it can be best. Well, I think that it can be proven by an OECD article that I've cited numerous times in my books, that the original gap in wealth between what was the poor countries and the rich countries was 12-1 during Marx's time at about the 1850s, and that today it's like 72-1. And that massive growth gap between the two, especially given that trade is so completely international at this time, that things are flying all over the world. I mean, we have, dig up the whatever metal in this place, send it to this place to be processed, this place to be put into an electronic, and then electronic sent somewhere else to be sold. The global economy is completely integrated, or almost completely integrated. And I don't think anybody would disagree with that.
Hey,
but I think that,
if I may interject, I believe the original topic was EU imperialism and whether or not the living conditions of the first world are made possible with imperialism.
I mean, he was kind of getting into that like a little bit, and I kind of I did want to respond to him as well.
But my only question is, what does Soviet foreign policy have to do with the price of rice in China, my friend?
I also thought, I thought like we were going to like just kind of, this was almost going to be like a bit more freeform, like we were going to do like a bunch of different things. Like we were also going to get into like imperialism and like what defines imperialism and like Soviet foreign policy and stuff.
You guys can shoot the shit about that all you want. It's just I thought the topic originally is you were going to be talking about social democracy, but it really is.
Yeah, I thought that was going to be like one of our big topics, and then we would slowly transition into like imperialism and stuff.
Yeah. Sure.
How about this? We can simplify this. Does imperialism exist?
Of course it does.
Okay, so we agree imperialism exists. So we can push that out of the way. We don't have to think about, because I was trying to argue that imperialism exists, and if we both agree that it exists, then I don't have to waste time on that.
Okay, I mean, like it wasn't like whether or not imperialism exists. It was more like a matter of like what is the definition of imperialism, and like more specifically was like did certain Soviet foreign policy decisions essentially constitute as imperialism. Those were that was kind of more what I wanted to focus on, rather than just does imperialism exist, which I mean, like obviously yes.
Okay, so obviously the definition that I would use, and I in my opinion, it's the only valid one, because it was the creator of it, was Lenin. A particular stage of monopoly capitalism, where essentially you have capital tends to concentrate. That's why we have in France there used to be 200 auto manufacturers, and now today we have a handful of them across the entire world. He lays down in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, why it reaches a certain monopoly point and then must expand beyond its own borders, or it's going to run into crisis. Like, for example, I mean, no rational person is going to argue that anything can expand forever. It's just literally impossible. There are limits to the amount of things you can sell in a country, and there will only be a finite amount, and that you do have to keep going outside the borders in order to do so. And that this need to not just expand beyond borders, but to get resources cheaper and cheaper as a part of not just the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, but as a part of competition in general is what forces world wars. And that was the argument that Lenin makes. Now, in his work, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, he mathematically points out exactly how it happened during his time. I mean, obviously, I can't remember the numbers offhand, but his work is freely available for anybody who wants to get it. And these were the capitalist countries that kept going, because there were no socialist states at the time that he wrote it. And that because of this, we would get a repeated cycle of world wars.
Obviously, he didn't predict the nuclear bomb, though. So, I mean, that
no.
didn't.
You know what? I was debating whether or not to bring that up.
So I actually have read Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. Like, my issue, though, I think with your argument is that, one, based on the research that I've done, Lenin didn't actually invent the term imperialism. The term imperialism first came about,
the definition, that definition he created.
He created that definition, but he wasn't like, but I feel like my issue is that like you're treating it like this is like the only definition of imperialism. This is the only one that's like necessarily valid when
because that's what we're talking about.
Well, I mean, I guess for me, I would use like a slightly different definition. For me, I would describe colonialism as being kind of closer to what you're talking about, like specifically, an economic venture, usually done by a capitalist state to like extract profits from a certain like country, like, you know, like the British in India, for example, as far as like a commercial enterprise to specifically extract profit to benefit like certain capitalists or the state or whatever. Whereas I would define imperialism as just like the action of conquest or like conquering of another state. But it could be for reasons that are, economic or political or ideological. It just involves like direct conquest. It doesn't necessarily have to be in relation to capital. That would for me be colonialism. And like based on like all the definitions that I've read, I've looked, through the definition of imperialism, and as far as its history, this tends to be the definition that I believe is more like historically accurate as far as what we're talking about. And I would consider by that logic the Soviet Union to be an imperialist state.
See, this is where I would disagree. Lenin is talking about it as a stage of monopoly capital, where it's not so much that they just want profits, but they have no choice but in order to do so in order to maintain those profits. I mean, there's always a political cover for everything. I mean, I don't think that there's really anybody left that thinks that the Iraq War was about fighting for freedom or finding weapons of mass destruction. I mean, obviously that wasn't true.
It was a resource war. Or
yeah. But Lenin's point is that it has to happen because capitalism develops to a point of essentially like a monopoly level where there's nowhere else to expand to in their own borders, and it becomes necessary to expand into other borders. It's not like an ideological thing. I don't believe that capitalism even has any ideological basis. It's literally just about profits, and I don't believe that imperialist wars happen because they're just evil and they want money. They do it because they have to do it.
I mean, can I respond to that?
Yeah.
So I guess for me, like I don't necessarily disagree with that. Like the idea that like when like profits can't be extracted, they'll go like elsewhere to like extract new profits. That seems to be like a pretty historically verifiable thing. We saw that with the United States. Like once it had expanded westward enough, like there was the whole Turner thesis that predicted that imperialism would come next because like the U.S. had like basically achieved manifest destiny, and now it needed to go to like new places like the Philippines and Cuba and whatever to extract new resources. But I guess like for me, that would probably because like the two can coincide, But for me, I would consider like what you're talking about to be more like a form of colonialism, where I view imperialism as just like the invasion or subjugation of another state for the interest of that state or people who live within it. And the two can coincide, and they often do. Like, I mean, like the Spanish-American War might be an example, like when the U.S. Supported Cuban and Filipino rebels because they wanted to extract those profits from Spain. So the two often do coincide, but I see imperialism as being something that is just like a country subjecting another country. And by that logic, I would consider like this what the Soviets did in, for example, Hungary, in Czechoslovakia, and in Afghanistan to all essentially qualify under the basis of imperialism. So I don't necessarily disagree with what you were saying. I just sort of have different definitions as far as how to define it.
Yeah, because I would use Lenin's term because he showed mathematically not just that it happened, but why it had to happen as the very nature of the system itself, because it was based on profit making. And by virtue, competition forces the firms to do all manner of things, whether they be socially destructive or not.
Agree as much on like the actual concepts. We just kind of disagree on the definitions.
Yeah, but I'm saying Lenin's would be more accurate because that's the one that I think that we find today. Now, keep in mind that Lenin did refer to his imperialism as neo-colonialism.
I mean, I guess you could. I mean, I would probably. I think probably neo-colonialism would be a better way of describing it. I think that like. I think, though, that like part of my problem is that Lenin wrote that book specifically in 1917, where that specific kind of imperialism was the only kind of imperialism that really existed. And since then, while it has still maintained the dominant form of imperialism, we have seen a lot of like wars that I would consider to be imperialist fought for different reasons. Like I would consider I think you and I would agree, I would consider both the wars in Korea and Vietnam to be imperialist, but I wouldn't necessarily consider them to be imperialist just because the US was out for profits. I also think that it was like an ideological and geopolitical struggle as far as maintaining influence with the Soviet Union. And likewise, I would consider like the Soviet invasions of Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan, their involvement in a lot of countries in the third world as essentially being imperialist as far as them wanting to maintain their geopolitical sphere of influence. Also, by the way, I'm just curious before you go, I do want to know this because I genuinely don't know. What are your thoughts on like the Soviet invasions of like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Afghanistan? Because I mean, you're a Maoist, and Maoists generally hold those as like in bad regard, like they see them as like revisionist. But I know that like you might have like different views on these things. So I'm just genuinely curious.
Yeah. In my opinion, the Czechoslovakia, I'm not really familiar with that one, but I can say with Hungary, it was basically subversive measures trying to break up socialism. I don't think it was actually really necessary to send in the tanks, but it was something that should have been stopped. I mean, that resistance was basically like a bunch of, like, I believe it was a bunch of students that were just trying to essentially overthrow that system, like we saw with like the big protests in Iran. Was it this year or last year? Either way, I can't remember. It was basically like 200 college students. Like
the word is color revolution. That's
yeah, but there was no color revolution at the time. But yeah, but it would fit that definition. Yes, like the ones that took place in Iran, like I said, either this year or last year, where it was like 200 college students protesting in the Western media. It was like, oh, there's this massive uprising going on, and it's like, no, it was like 200 college students. It wasn't anything. I would argue that in the case of Afghanistan, the Communist Party of Afghanistan asked them to come in and helped. Not me, but I know a guy who's very, very, very well versed with the Soviet-Afghan conflict, and he would be able to give a lot more information than I could, but say like they were invited in as a measure. to defend socialism inside of Afghanistan, because I don't think anybody really wants a Taliban-controlled world. I mean, I couldn't imagine. I guess technically ISIS is worse, but I don't think anybody really wants that.
Okay, can I respond to both those points? Because these are both ones where I pretty strongly disagree. So in the case of Hungary, I don't really think it's fair to call what happened with those student protests a color revolution. It was a very large protest movement as a response to the ousting of, I believe, Emir Nagy, who ended up being like the leader of the Hungarian Revolution. And he was a communist. And a lot of the people who protested were like socialists and communists. And he still wanted to maintain the economic system, but he was an advocate for a lot of like political liberalization as far as having Soviet troops withdraw from Hungary and Hungary leaving the Warsaw Pact and becoming like a neutral nation like Yugoslavia, as far as like abolishing the secret police and as far as abolishing the secret police and establishing like a more democratic form of government. And also something that is sort of not always mentioned is the fact that during the revolution, there was a series of like independent workers' councils and independent sort of cooperatives that started forming within that revolution. So if anything, I would consider the Soviet intervention in Hungary to be somewhat counter-revolutionary in that it was, and perhaps even reactionary in that it was targeting a sort of more democratic, more less restrictive form of socialism, though I'd imagine you disagree with me on that. As far as Afghanistan, I hear this sort of, well, the like Afghan government invited the Soviets in. Well, I mean, okay, but like the South Vietnamese invited the Americans in to do the Vietnam War. That doesn't necessarily mean what they did was okay. And the Soviets, I mean, the PDP and the like Afghan Socialist Republic was super unpopular. Like at their peak, they could only get like 65,000 troops. And many of them like were pretty low on morale, whereas Mujahideen were able to get like 200,000. So like so like you say, like who'd want to live in a Taliban controlled state? Well, I wouldn't, but apparently the Afghans would. Although to be fair, the Taliban emerged in the Afghan civil war. The Mujahideen was basically just anyone who was opposed to the communist government. There were Maoists in the Mujahideen, and there were people who formed like the Northern Alliance were part of the Mujahideen. And we often, something else is that like, the Soviets fought for 10 years. Obviously, they lost because, I mean, their intervention wasn't really all that popular with the Afghan people. And they committed a bunch of really gruesome atrocities that a lot of people aren't really familiar with. I mean, they'd like massacre entire cities and like annihilate them just to weed out guerrillas. There are stories of them like executing children to like so they wouldn't be able to like spread the word about the war crimes.
Come on, that sounds like they just went around.
I can't confirm that one, but like I do know that they like engaged in like a quite a few like large scale massacres. They would like annihilate entire villages. I mean,
I'm very skeptical.
500,000 to like 2 million. It was a pretty brutal war. I mean, they call it the Soviets Vietnam for a reason. So I really can't.
I would actually argue the Soviets technically didn't lose. Their whole purpose was to stop the Mujahideen advance, which they actually did do for the most part. And then when what it is that they were there to accomplish, which was done, they left.
And then it fell apart. Like
they didn't actually lose why they were there. They were there to stop this particular advance and then pulled out.
Like the second they pulled out, like everything like went to crap. It's kind of like
I agree.
It's kind of like when the people argue that like the Iraq war troop surge like in 2007 was like the thing that was going to like make everything better. It's like, okay, but like the second that the like US pulled out, then everything went to shit, and then ISIS started coming.
No, I would say that it's not the same thing because the Soviets for one specific purpose.
Or it's at least equivocal. I mean, like it's the problem. Like the long-standing problem is that you can't really win guerrilla war. Like the I mean, the only case where I can think of where like a guerrilla war was really won was the British in Malaysia, and even then, that still continued well
Oh, come
after
on,
that.
Cuba.
Like, the U.S. couldn't do it in Vietnam. The Napoleonic French couldn't do it in Spain. The Soviets couldn't do it in Afghanistan. The U.S. couldn't do it in Iraq. Like, you can't really win a guerrilla war because usually guerrilla wars indicate that like whatever rule you're trying to force is deeply unpopular. And in that case, it was deeply unpopular. And the second that the Soviets were going to leave, which they eventually had to, in the same way that the U.S. eventually had to leave Iraq, these popular forces were inevitably going to like retake the country. It was just an unwinnable war. Like, same with like the Vietnam War. I mean, I don't believe for a second the U.S. could have ever won in Vietnam.
Okay. I would respond by saying I don't necessarily think that the Communist Party of Afghanistan was really all that unpopular.
No,
I want to respond to this. I would say that the main
sorry, I don't interrupt.
The main problem was that they were atheist, and there is a bad history of not respecting the religious certain aspects of societies, and I think that was the main thing. I mean, even bin Laden himself, when he was an anti-Soviet fighter, he said, "Oh, we have to stop the atheists." It wasn't even really about, whether. I mean, they couldn't really look at universal healthcare and education and say, "Oh, this is bad. We have to stop this." They perceived it as a atheist threat. I would say they were actually wrong in that case, and the socialists did come into power popularly, and then invited the Soviets in to help them. Well, the difference in Vietnam was that I keep getting Diem and Thieu mixed up. I think Diem was the guy who assassinated.
Diem was the guy who ruled like right after the emperor fell until 1963 when Thieu overthrew him.
He was anti-U.S. occupation, and then all of a sudden he got assassinated, and then this U.S. puppet came in and then said, "Oh, hey, U.S. Army coming in and save us
was already basically a U.S. puppet. Thieu was more so a U.S. puppet.
Hey,
I keep forgetting which one was which.
Diem was the first guy who was the Catholic, and he suppressed like the Buddhists. And by the way, fellow traveler, are you saying something?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask real quick. Could you clarify your definition of imperialism again?
Me or Jason?
No, just you. I know. Me.
Okay, so for me, like, I would distinguish colonialism. I would say is closer to what Jason is describing, as far as like specifically like pursuing economic profits as a through other countries as a means of like empowering capitalists or the state or whatever. Whereas imperialism, I would simply kind of just describe as whenever like a country offensively invades another country as a means of securing influence for that state, whether that be political or economic or ideological.
All right. So your definition is basically when big country does something to small country. Got it.
Well, not entirely. It's specifically when I would describe it as like when generally a large power, although not always, invades or occupies or tries to support a certain proxy force, or like intervenes in their political affairs as a means of trying to gain a certain level of political or economical or ideological influence. So it's basically when another country involves itself in the political affairs of another country to try to gain influence in that country for whatever reason. Basically,
but the thing is that I'm sorry, this isn't even my debate. I shouldn't even be talking right now. But the issue with a lot of the examples you're giving of quote unquote Soviet imperialism is really like a form of defensive expansionism, because they were sort of fighting a Cold War.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't really call it defensive, at least not with the Warsaw Pact.
Excuse me.
I'm sorry.
I'm talking. There was a country on the other side of the planet, along with a block of countries by their side, that worked overtime from the get-go, day and night, to see to it that the only existing socialist country at the time was going to be obliterated, and would have been more than happy to unleash the Nazis on them if it wasn't for the fact that the Nazis were threatening British and French colonies and stepping closer and closer to their territory, and actively tried to appeal to the Nazis. If it wasn't for that, they would have been more than happy to let the Nazis bulldoze through Eastern Europe and just let it happen, not even get involved. So what I'm trying to say is that in a world where there are capitalist entrenched imperialist capitalist powers that, one, had a century to head start to industrialize, as well as two, centuries of colonialism and empire building, all those resources built up, all that piled up, and they say, ooh, what's this? It's a new system coming along, and they're improving living standards and doing really well for themselves, and they're doing it without facilitating a greedy class of oligarchs. So they see that as a threat. Do you now see why a lot of the actions that the Soviets took were necessary and why they had to control?
I mean, I can see why. I can maybe see why some of them are. I mean, first of all, this is. I don't want to like.
I like how the second I opened my mouth, the viewers jumped to 120 down from 113.
I mean, like, as far as this goes, I mean, I don't want to like devalue because you've been doing a good job, but I mean, I think your job is like to moderate the discussion between.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Like I said, this isn't even.
I mean, I'm down with talking to you about this stuff afterwards or doing this during a debate, but like right now, this conversation is between like us and Jason. So, I mean, would you mind like me maybe putting like a hold on that?
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Talk about this afterwards or some other time. I just like, for me, I'm really more interested in talking about the stuff with Jason. But I guess like if I were to briefly just say, I mean, I don't necessarily think that like everything the USSR did was bad or unjustified, but in the case of these things specifically, you know, the crushing of independent. So, okay, dude, seriously, like your job is to be the mod. You're not supposed to take sides in this stuff. Like, really, like, come on, dude. Come on, man. Like, I mean, like I
already said that I'll step out, and I already apologized for interjecting. It's
I mean, it's cool, man. It's just like, dude, I don't want to. I know, like, this might make me look bad, but like, if you're gonna be the mod, like, be the mod. Like, don't like be.
Yeah,
I'm gonna be objective while I'm going to like. Meanwhile, take shots at me. I mean, I don't want to like be super harsh because I've had like positive conversations with you in the past. But like, come on, man.
I'm sorry that I interjected, and I'm sorry that I dropped that on you. I will step out and quietly let you and Jason get back at it. It's just Jason wasn't saying anything, and I'm not going to lie. I've been wanting to say something for like the last hour, 2 minutes, and 15 seconds. But I will fully step out and let you guys go back to it.
Okay. I just want to interject one thing. Fellow Trevor, did you tell him that I only had an hour?
I did. So if you'd like to step out, you and I.
Yeah. Okay. See, the thing is that it's Christmas and I'm going to family.
Okay. Have a Merry Christmas.
Yeah. So I mean, the thing is, I got to go visit. I'm going to go visit family now, and that's why I only got an hour because like this was sort of just scheduled haphazardly, like thing. That's why I pushed for the thing with the serfs to be on that particular day because that was the day before I had to get ready to leave and visit family for Christmas.
Okay.
So I mean, I got my mom's already texting me right now, asking me if I've left yet. So like I am sorry. We could do this on another subject, same subject, whatever, another time. I mean, if you guys want to go at it now.
Yeah, I think after what happened, I think I'm more than happy to spend the rest of the time talking with fellow traveler because I think he's been itching to do this, and I've been wanting to do this as well. So I think that me and him will just talk for like, I don't know, next 30, 45 minutes, and then we'll let you get to your family. Happy holidays as always. And
yeah, thank you. And this was actually a very good conversation. God knows it was a lot better than the one I had yesterday.
For sure. And by the way, fellow traveler, has he paid you the $50 yet?
No, he owes me $50.
Or sorry, that's what I meant. Like, have you paid him the $50 yet?
Don't worry, I'm going to pay him. Don't worry. We shook on it. I'm a man of my word. So
okay, listen. Here's to a better debate than the one that you had.
So I'll give you that.
Okay, so I'll go, and then you guys can do what you're going to do. I'll see you later.
People in the chat are saying they want me to bring LT on. Should I do
LT can come on. I mean, I don't care. I'll do like like those old Destiny debates where he does like 1-on-6. I'll do then Jason, and then I'll do you, and then I'll do Leftism today.
No,
I mean,
I'm gonna get back to being quiet. I mean, LT's a more aggressive debater than Jason. I won't have to say anything. But here,
I mean, okay. I mean, I guess that I guess maybe you and I could talk for a little bit, and then we could maybe let Leftism today in, and then him and I could talk. So anyway, I mean, you obviously like were taking shots at me during the thing, and then like accused me of backpedaling. So as far as like the whole like socialism under siege thing, this is the thing that I talked about in the Danke King discussion. I can understand it to a certain extent, but my problem is that then I feel like it gets used as basically like a get out of jail free card for like literally everything the Soviet Union ever did, even in the case of like stuff that like in the like stuff that I think even
I certainly agree. I don't disagree that they made mistakes from a foreign policy standpoint, and they definitely had excesses. This is what states do. This is what governments do. They're not infallible bodies. They're fallible human beings that make fucking mistakes. It's just interesting to me how whenever the United States seem to make mistakes, it turns out to be the right thing to do. But then when
hey, dude, I think you're I'm literally in the process of making a video about every single fucking terrible thing that Henry Kissinger ever did. I'm not some like naive America fanboy who says that like America is infallible.
All right. I know, and I'm not accusing you. I'm just saying like it's a trend, a general trend that I've noticed.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I felt as if you were accusing me of that.
No, you misunderstand. My point is that there's like a double standard, a general double standard. And when I see a lot of the things the Soviets did, generally I see that they made a lot of mistakes and they even committed war crimes. But the thing is that their excesses is a drop in the bucket compared to a lot of the bullshit that the Western countries have done. And compared to the excesses of the Soviets, look at what the Soviets are pursuing, dude. They're pursuing a world free of capitalists, a world free of exploitation, where people can go on and live the kind of life they actually want to live, where there's no more hunger or poverty and everybody's needs are met. That's the kind of world they're pursuing. Meanwhile, America and the Western colonial bloc, despite, their declarations of freedom and democracy, what are they looking for? What are they trying to pursue? You see what I'm saying? Like, what is it besides private enrichment? And that's the reason.
Well, I mean, you're right. It's profit. I don't disagree with that.
Yeah. And that's where I'm coming from. And there's like, barring Afghanistan and like the Khmer Rouge, there really hasn't been any country that's gone socialist that hasn't seen a substantial increase in living conditions and the general wealth and livelihood for its people.
Well, there was Czechoslovakia experience, like because it was already industrialized, and a lot of the moves to have enforced like a Soviet model on it really didn't work. That's part of why you get that's part of why you got Dubček. And as far can I Leftism today before I start talking to you? Can I really respond to some of the stuff that fellow traveler said? So I mean, I entirely agree with you when you say that like the United States, doesn't give a fuck about democracy or human rights. They essentially do all of what they do for profit. Occasionally they make the right decision. For the most part, they've supported fascists, they've supported military coups, they've supported offensive borderline genocidal invasions like in Vietnam. I mean, like, fuck American foreign policy, for real. I think that's one thing both of us would agree on. But my issue is that I feel like you have a slightly naive perception of like why the Soviets did what they did. It's sort of like it's almost kind of the way I think some liberals perceive like American foreign policy, that like, oh, we did like all of these bad things, but they were ultimately like in the interests of like freedom and democracy. We just kind of did like a little oopsie. And I kind of feel like you're doing that, but from like the opposite perspective. You're saying like, oh yeah, the Soviets made some mistakes, they made some oopsies, but they were ultimately trying to make the world a better place. Ignoring that, like the suppression of more independent socialist ideals in the Warsaw Pact, or the suppression of like the popular will in Afghanistan, or the supporting of, several pretty brutal regimes in other places. I mean, you brought up the Khmer Rouge. Obviously, during the Vietnamese-Cambodian War, the Soviets supported the Vietnamese, but they supported the Khmer Rouge be before they came into power.
They probably didn't know the Rouge was going to turn out the way it was. I mean, no one.
I mean, to be fair, but like you didn't think that like the Mujahideen was going to turn into the Taliban. That doesn't necessarily make it like okay that like we did what we did.
Well, yeah, there's a difference. The Soviets were backing a socialist republic, while the United States was backing right-wing theocratic douchebags.
I mean, but like they both ended up, I guess, just from like a purely consequentialist perspective, they both ended up evolving into tyrannical, murderous, reactionary dictatorships. I guess for me, like it's just like, I mean, I can acknowledge like, is there a little bit of a distinction? Like, yeah, maybe, but like ultimately the like results are the same.
I wouldn't necessarily say that. I mean,
I don't know. I mean, the Khmer Rouge, I would say, was probably worse than the Taliban. I would go that easily.
I don't know about that, but what
no, dude. Like, I mean, like, was the Taliban like basically enforcing theocracy like fucking terrible? Like, of course, but like the Khmer Rouge literally killed 1 Cambodian and 4. Like, I mean, there are layers, and like Khmer Rouge was way fucking worse.
Most of the people that died under Pol Pot were from the carpet bombing done by the United States.
No, dude. Like a lot of them, like there were huge amounts of like for like ethnic minorities. A lot of them were like prominent intellectuals. Like, I mean, were some of them like people who were like allies to like Law Nol and like the Khmer Republic? Like, sure, but like a pretty decent chunk of them were like religious and ethnic and minorities and intellectuals and shit like that. I don't even know. Like, if I were to look up the Cambodian genocide, I don't even think that like the Khmer Republic guys were really one of the major targets. Like here, okay, so Cambodian targets included.
I don't.
Okay, yeah, it did. Okay, actually, I was wrong. It did include some of the previous military and political leadership, but it also included like a fair amount of like people who were basically innocent. I think you would agree with that.
Dude, I don't know how many times I have to repeat myself. I don't stand the Khmer Rouge.
Okay, I'm not saying that you stand the Khmer Rouge.
The Vietnamese were right to go in there and kick their asses out. You know,
I agree with that completely.
Yeah, no. So, like I said, states make mistakes. The stuff that the Soviets have done still a drop in the bucket compared to the bullshit that the Western colonial bloc has pulled off. And
I mean, it depends on like depends on like if
right now.
All right.
I mean, if we're talking, I mean, it depends on like. Sorry,
I'm muting both of you. I am a fucking communist. I want to work towards a classless society. We have 2 hegemonic world powers. One that supports a class society, the other one does not. And from my point of view, even though that other one has its flaws and its shortcomings, I would rather stand and support the power that has no class society and is working towards a classless society. That is all.
Okay. I mean, I would disagree with the idea that the Soviets were like a classless society.
They literally didn't have a class.
Okay.
No, dude.
Yeah, okay, hold on. Let's all chill. Okay, let's all chill.
What?
Okay, man on the wall. First of all, we have to talk about some definitions, right? And I don't want to go about talking about semantics. I don't want to hear what you personally think. We have to define this scientifically and historically, okay? So the whole point of us going out here and reading these books is so that we can get a historical, real definition. There is no disputing these definitions, right? So first of all, I mean, what do you think a class is? First of all,
what do I think a class is? Well,
yeah.
I mean, generally, maybe not artificially. It's generally like a portion of society, generally defined by their relation to the overall hierarchy. I would say, for the most part, at least in a sociological sense, if we're talking like specific.
Okay, well, let's talk economically, right? So,
I think that like the sociological extent of it matters. I wouldn't necessarily say that the Soviet Union was like a class system in like a purely economic sense, but in terms of like a sociological sense, like I mean, in a
all right, well, we have 30 minutes, so let me walk you down a Socratic path because we have 30 minutes.
Why the you keep interrupting me? I was literally just.
Homie, this isn't okay. Let's walk down a Socratic path, okay? You know what Socratic means, right? It means yes or no, okay? Let's walk down this path.
Sure.
Okay, first of all, do
Yeah.
you consider yourself to be a leftist or not?
I consider myself to be a social democrat, so take with that what you will.
So you're a capitalist then.
Yes, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, so you're not on the left, first of all. So do you know what
Well,
capitalism
I think
is,
that,
or
like,
do you
I don't
not?
necessarily think that it's that like the left-right paradigm is as simple as people who oppose capitalism are right wing and people who it's people who oppose capitalism are left wing and people who support it are right wing. I think that I mean, I would consider social democracy, at least in a practical sense, a fairly left-leaning ideology. I mean, maybe you disagree with that, but I mean, I don't know.
Sure. Do you know what capitalism is? Do you actually know what it is?
Okay. First of all, this is all a bit condescending, but whatever. Capitalism is generally the idea where means of production are owned privately by individuals. They're known as capitalists. Generally, there's a free market. Generally, you have a free market as well. That would probably be my definition, more or less.
Okay, that's part of it, but that's also false because first of all, if we go back in time, let's look at feudal times. Okay, feudal times, we had lords, and lords owned the means of production privately. Sure, they partitioned some of their land to give to the serfs, but what capitalism is yes, it's private ownership of the means of production, but what it also is a market with wage labor, and the whole purpose of this market is to accumulate value. Now, this value is, like what Jason Unruhe was saying, ultimately an equal exchange, which means that what's going to happen is if you want to support social democracy in the first world, right, what happens is that a company is going to come to the first world because that's just where they're based, and they're going to go to the third world, and because the third world government is corrupt, they're going to allow them to absolutely exploit the hell out of their workers. Exploit meaning that the value they produce is going to be far significantly less than the wage. So what happens is that you got two options, right? You can tax the companies in the first world and give the money to the people, or you can have the just capitalists get all the money themselves. So that's basically what social democracy is. It's when
Okay,
you're
so
giving the money.
Okay, can I respond to this?
Yes, you can.
I agree that there is definitely a problem where first world companies go to the third world, exploit the shit out of their workers. I mean, obviously that's a problem. I mean, just look at fucking Nike. What I would suggest is that then the solution to that is to in the first world provide policies that essentially regulate these corporations, make sure that in addition to paying, providing health services and a living wage and whatnot to the people who work for them in the first world, that they also do that for people who work in the third world. You could essentially applying social democracy not just to those workers in the first world, but to perhaps indirectly people in the third world as well. I don't necessarily agree with the idea that social democracy can only exist through this exploitation. Does this exploitation exist to some extent? Sure. Is it a problem? Of course it is. But I mean, I don't necessarily agree with your assertion that like the only way that we can do this is just like we have like this mass exploitation and we can either just like tax billionaires and like take the money and give it into social programs or just let them get away with everything. We can also stop them from exploiting third world labor and then tax the shit out of them anyway with social democracy. I mean, I think that you're creating an unnecessary paradigm in order to try to bait me and make my ideology look bad. I understand that there's imperial exploitation, but I think that there are ways to fix it through social democracy, as like the ways that I'm proposing to you right now.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a pipe dream because what you're expecting is the people who run Congress and give the money to Congress, who are the big corporations like Nike, like cigarette companies, and like we want to talk about interrupting. You're interrupting me now.
Okay, sorry.
So what you're doing is you're expecting the corporations to go out of their way and basically piss on themselves for morals, but that's not going to happen. We have to do this scientifically, right? So in the real world, what we should do is we should go and seize the power away from those corporations in order to have a planned economy. Now, what does a planned economy do? Well, basically, there's something called the law of value, right? There's a reason why imperialism exists in the first place, and that's because we are a value-derived and a value-oriented world. We want more profit. How you get more profit is by charging more for giving a lower wage, basically. So what you're basically saying is we're going to have this pipe dream where we're going to go to Congress, who, by the way, are already owned by the big corporations, Raytheon, et cetera. We're just going to tell them to stop. We're going to go to the third world. We're going to tell them to regulate, more regulations. Why hasn't that happened yet? Why has that not happened? What is your magical solution?
I don't know. I mean, it's sort of like, well, no country's ever abolished the police before. Why advocate for doing it? I mean, that's kind of like we propose. We keep building on new ideas. We keep coming up with and creating new ideas. I mean, that's, as far as like Nike owning stuff, I mean, this is why, like, for example, on the Danky Kang stream, I said that one of the biggest issues that I care about is creating campaign finance reform and to get money out of politics. And obviously, I'm not naive or stupid. I don't think that they're just going to we're just going to literally walk up and say like, hey, could you please stop exploiting the third world? Like, no, we do this through, mass protest. We do this through direct action. We do this through do this through, writing to congressmen and senators. We do this through, like a full-blown movement, like progressive movement, to first get welfare benefits, then get money out of politics, and then with that money out of politics, we do serious things to try to prevent companies from exploiting the third world through just applying regulations on how they can like interact with third world nations. I mean, we don't even necessarily have to go to the third world nations to make this work. We could just do it like inside Congress. Now, obviously, it's going to be a long process and it's going to take a lot of time, but so would like a workers' revolution where you seize a means of production. Like, either way, these things take a lot more time. And the reason I support that as opposed to like seizing the means of production is because, one, I think that like as far as at least American society, we're way closer to doing my proposed solution than yours. And then secondly, there's also the fact that seizing the means of production would undoubtedly lead to a huge amount of violence that would honestly, in a lot of ways, make the third world worse. Because let's say there's a socialist revolution in the U.S. and the U.S. economy crashes, that means a lot of countries that rely on U.S. aid are going to like slip even further into poverty, and there's going to be like probably a bunch of huge famines. I mean, look at like how with like COVID, there's going to probably be a bunch of huge famines in the third world because countries are cutting aid. Like, I mean, I think that like we romanticize like these whole like big glorious revolutions. I mean, keep in mind that in a situation like this, millions and millions and millions of people would die. So that's basically my solution.
Right, but do you see how inherent to the system itself? It's not like a scratch. It's an inherent problem, because inherently you have to double your economy every 25 years. Inherently, you have to exploit. This isn't something that you can just patch, right? Because that's what Jason Unruhe was saying. That's why mutualism is a complete meme. Because in order to gain profits, you have to pay someone less, ultimately, which is what exploitation is, surplus value. You have to pay someone less and you have to charge more. Now, you might say, well, what if we just pay everyone the max amount and we just up the prices? Well, what will happen is that a competitor will come in, charge less, pay the same, and then they will make more profit. So it's inherent into the system. Capitalism is not sustainable because you can't just double everything every 25 years. The problem is that when you try to double everything every 25 years, you have to go to corrupt nations like the Philippines, where they're murdering drug addicts, and you have to have those people in those factories basically exploit themselves. And it's just not a sustainable system. This whole pipe dream that, we're just going to go ask the rich people to go break their own window, it's never going to happen.
I mean,
the only way that it would happen is if we went forward and we destroyed the state itself. And by the way, in terms of abolishing the police, we have a scientific method to abolish the police. The police exist because of class, and what you're asking for is class. You're asking for certain people to own the means of production, which would be class. If you're not asking for certain people to own the means of production, then you contradict yourself because you're not a capitalist.
Okay. So, I don't necessarily disagree with the idea that like capitalism is I've said this like in basically every single discussion that I've had. I don't think that capitalism is like eternally sustainable. One day, who knows? Maybe the system that I'm advocating for would just inevitably lead to socialism because it just turns out that like you can't really make it work without exploitation, which is something that like maybe I'm willing to like look into. It's a possibility, but I think that like my ideal of creating a system of reforms to prevent like third world exploitation is a lot more realistic and probably quite a bit more efficient than your idea of like, well, let's just like abolish all class and like seize the means of production. And also, like, there's the issue of, while there is a lot of exploitation, I know this might sound like super like naive of me, but you do see that like in a lot of these third world countries, their GDP is growing. I mean, look at like all the massive industrial boom that India has gone through. Look at the like industrial booms that like Africa is going through. I mean, granted, you're still talking about like people going from like $1 a day to like $5 a day, but it's still like an important change. And I think that like eventually we could get to a point where like these countries could be industrialized enough that they could like pay workers a decent wage. So I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the idea that like capitalism necessarily necessitates like this global inequality. I mean, we have seen like poor nations become extremely wealthy. I mean, previous to the Second World War, many of the Scandinavian countries were like fairly impoverished. I mean, we've seen like things like the East Asian tigers, for instance, as well as quite a few others.
Yeah, I would say that the Soviet Union did the exact same thing by electrifying the country. I mean, Lenin electrified the country, and then Stalin went in and industrialized the country.
I mean, I don't disagree with that, but I think like I've talked about this in like my videos. I think that like and I know Vash talked about this with his discussion with you, is that basically I think that like basically every country had a huge industrial boom. I don't think that's necessarily something that's inherent to socialism. I think if the whites had won the Russian Civil War, they probably would have done the same thing. It might have taken a longer period of time, but they still would have done it. Same with like the Chinese nationalists. I think that this is just kind of like a natural process that that was going to happen one way or another. It might happen later. I might concede that, and I will concede that like the Soviets did industrialize pretty efficiently and effectively, even though a lot of people did die in the process. But I don't necessarily think that like the industrialization is something that's just inherently related to their economic system. I think it's more just kind of. I mean, we can see that. Wait, can I just make one more point?
Yeah. Go ahead.
For example, like, China is industrializing right now. And I mean, I don't know if you consider China like socialist or not, but like they have like a more like state oriented economy. And India is also industrializing right now. And they're more like they have like a more capitalist free market economy, two very different economic systems, both going through major industrial booms. I think that like in those cases, I don't think it really mattered which economic system they had, whether they were communist or capitalist or whatever. They were going to have like a big industrial boom. It was only a matter of time.
You made your point.
Yeah.
Okay. I did make my point, yes.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to say really quick that the USSR had the second highest GDP in the world, and it also significantly increased its economy during the Great Depression. So, yeah, that doesn't really work.
I mean, how does that? I mean, I agree with that, but that doesn't disprove my argument.
I mean, if you want to talk more another time, then I'm on Discord. But yeah, I gotta go. So
okay, cool. Well, see you then. This was an interesting chat, to say the least.
Keep boofing.
Sweet.
Okay, so we're almost at an hour and a half. I've talked to now 3 people.
Yeah, we can end this if you want, but I guess
is there anything else you want to talk about? We can talk for like another 10 minutes, and then like we can just call it off or whatever.
Yeah, honestly, I think this has been good therapy for you. You learned a lot. Wow,
I think hopefully Leftism today and Jason Unruhe learned a few things as well.
To be honest, dude, I was where you were at politically years ago. Most of the things that you're talking about are, with all due respect, things I already know. And through your logic of wanting to improve the system, I mean, it's well-intentioned, but the thing is that all we're doing is taking that rationale to its logical conclusion, all right? So the reason why, actually, I don't even want to argue that. So I do want to talk about what you said in terms of the rapidity of Soviet industrialization. It is true that socialism is not the only system that can industrialize a country, but historically, it's done it faster and it's done it better. And the only times there have been countries that have like outpaced Soviet economic development is when they were reined in under the Marshall Plan and had like the literal backing of the United States.
Or I guess you could say South Korea to some extent, like they industrialized.
Yeah, exactly.
That's not. I mean, I'll grant you that. Like, I mean, granted, like China took a while. Like the real, like obviously they tried it like in the 50s and 60s, but like the real like big industrial stuff really started going under like Deng Xiaoping and with the market reforms.
And I do not stand Deng, but the thing is that the truth is with China, they're going to be growing for a while because they still have hundreds of millions of people that have yet to be proletarianized. They still
that's the thing is that like most of the wealth in China is mostly like concentrated in like big cities. So if you go to like Shanghai and Beijing, like they're super industrialized, like metropolitan places. But then you go to just like a few miles outside and it's like a backwater. Like they don't even have like running water and shit.
Yeah, exactly. China has room to grow, and they will be growing for decades to come. Eventually, their growth is going to come to a snail's crawl, and it's probably going to be 3 or 4 decades from now. And the reason why this is because after there's like an S-shaped curve with countries' economic growth. Like usually, what will happen is they're undeveloped, deindustrialized, they industrialize, they peak. And then their economic growth starts to slow to a snail's crawl as productive forces become more and more advanced.
Are we talking like specifically like when it comes to like countries like China and India that specifically went through colonization, or just like in general?
In general, yeah, this is true with any country. It's kind of a no-brainer. Like when you advance productive forces, general improvements in technology, science, innovation generally increases the general levels of wealth in society. But there's a key difference here. The socialist countries did it faster, more efficiently, and they had a much more egalitarian spread of the wealth. And they were able to show that you can develop a country without facilitating a class of greedy oligarchs. They are able to achieve better public health outcomes, and they're able to advance and innovate. Like the whole thing about like socialism not innovating is pure conjecture pure myth, by the way.
I don't entirely disagree with that. I think that there are ways in which like at least like with markets like that that make like certain types of innovation easier. Like for example, when it comes to like luxury goods, like with cars, for example, like when it comes to like cars, for example, I think even you would say that like the capitalist countries like outpace the non-capitalist ones.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. When in terms of cars, TVs, and McDonald's, the capitalist countries have done a very good job satisfying quote unquote wants. However, when it comes to stuff that people actually need, like healthcare, we don't get it. Take America.
It's kind of like why I'm a social democrat. Like I believe generally that like when it comes to wants, I think or luxury goods, I think like capitalism and free markets are the best way to go. But when it comes to things that like people need, I'm in favor of a more like, I guess, centralized approach when it comes to this stuff. When it comes to things like healthcare, like, or even like education or stuff like that.
Well, here's my ultimate problem with your disposition. I'm just going to say this, and I'm going to go ahead and terminate the stream. But my ultimate problem with the social democratic consciousness is that it's a patch on a system that's fundamentally broken. Capitalism is a zero-sum game. Their gain is our loss and vice versa, and they will always have an incentive and a motivation to slice away and chip away at those reforms. They'll always have an incentive to do imperialism. All of the negative externalities that are associated with this system are emergent from the capitalist system itself, and it would be a lot easier for us to address address those issues if we went to a transition to a socialist planned economy. And yeah, it's going to take a proletarian revolution to do that. So,
this is something that like the two of us could discuss for hours, and we could get into a whole bunch of different issues. Personally, I think that like the kind of like things that you were talking about can mostly be I know this might sound naive to you, but I think most of this could be fixed through like broad standing, like what I consider sort of the separation of the political and the capital through like publicly funded elections. And that way you wouldn't see like, I guess, the big bourgeois having such a huge influence over the way that like government institutions are run. But I already talked about this a lot in the Danky King debate, and I'll probably talk about this with you again. Because I imagine we'll probably at some point be doing something just one-on-one. But I did actually enjoy this conversation. It got a lot more heated, especially with Leftism today. I know I got really mad at you when you interrupted, did the whole thing, like the insinuating that I was like backpedaling. But I do appreciate our talks. I appreciate your opportunity to give that. I'm now interacted with 4 relatively, I guess, large tanky channels. And as far as how well I did, I'll have to see. Maybe people think that I did pretty well. Maybe some people think that I got completely BTFO'd. But I enjoy talking.
All I'm going to say is I believe your good faith, and I believe in time you probably won't become a hardline ML, but I can at the very least get you to become a socialist.
Okay. Well, we'll see about that. Anyway, I appreciate us talking, and I guess we'll just call it at that. See you, man.
Yeah. Good night, everyone. I'm going to go make dinner. Take it easy.
I'm going to go do something else.